Today we explore the top 2 houses with disturbing backstories. First up is the infamous LaLaurie Mansion in New Orleans. This building is home to the souls of many tortured slaves and was also portrayed in the popular TV show American Horror Story. Next up is a truly brutal case. The Villisca Axe Murder House is where 8 people, including 6 children, were viciously bludgeoned to death with an axe. Although multiple families tried to call it home after the murders, none of them stayed long, reporting ghostly footsteps, objects moving by themselves, and eerie shadows in the night. Every week we count down the top 2 true crimes or dark stories from around the world, so be sure to subscribe to our channel to catch the latest episode each week. Now join us as we count down the top 2 houses with disturbing backstories. Number 1. The LaLaurie Mansion. The LaLaurie Mansion is located at 1140 Royal Street, New Orleans. Due to the horrific acts that were committed here and the subsequent ghostly sightings, some refer to it simply as the Haunted House. This house was home to the infamous Marie Delphine LaLaurie, a New Orleans socialite and serial killer who was believed to have tortured and murdered numerous slaves here. Delphine was born on March 19, 1787, to Louis and Marie McCarty. Her family consisted of prominent planners, merchants, and military officers, most of whom owned real estate and numerous slaves themselves. Delphine was only 4 years old when she witnessed the eruption of the Haitian slave revolution of 1791. This event had a profound impact on her and her family, as their own slaves even began to revolt. Things escalated further when her own uncle was murdered in 1771 by his own slaves. This revolution had a ripple effect across the United States and Haiti, causing multiple uprisings. In turn, many slaveholders began to abuse their slaves even more harshly out of fear of rebellion. The young Delphine was obviously affected by this, and it would later show in her despicable acts. Delphine would grow up and go on to marry 3 separate times, all to very prominent and powerful men. Her first husband would pass away just days before her first daughter was born, and her second husband would also pass away just 8 years after the start of their marriage. During her second marriage, she would also have 4 more children, all of whom would have to grow up without their father. These devastating events no doubt added to the mental deterioration of Delphine. Her third and final marriage was a bit more controversial in that she married a physician that was 15 years her junior, Leonard Louis LaLaurie. Together in 1831, they purchased the property at 1140 Royal Street that would later be home to her unimaginable acts of violence. Unlike previous marriages, her marriage to LaLaurie was an unhappy one, and he was reported to be abusive. With neighbors constantly overhearing the couple argue and fight, finally in 1832, Delphine petitioned the courts for a separation. The split between the couple seemed to spiral Delphine even further into insanity, and she began to take out her anger and frustration on her slaves. Rumors began to spread around the neighborhood of the horrible mistreatment of her slaves, but the authorities paid little attention. One woman who visited the house was quoted by saying the slaves were singularly haggard and wretched. During this time, witnesses also reported an 8-year-old girl being thrown to her death from the mansion's roof. This event finally caused authorities to investigate and indict Delphine for extreme abuse. As a result, all of her slaves were set free, but sadly, she acquired them back through a third party and resumed their horrible torture. On the morning of April 10, 1834, one slave finally grew tired of the painful abuse. She decided to set the entire mansion ablaze, finally exposing the truth that Delphine was hiding behind the mansion walls. Firefighters would arrive to a gruesome sight. Inside the kitchen was the cook, a 70-year-old woman chained to a burning stove. She hurriedly directed the rescuers to the upper part of the building, where 7 other slaves were chained to the walls and floor. The story goes that one of the slaves had her bones broken so badly that she remained bent over and contorted in a permanent state of agony. Another slave had a hole drilled into his head and a wooden spoon sticking out. A third slave had skin peeled off with most of his muscles exposed, and another had his intestines removed and wrapped around his waist, while others were covered in honey and black ants. Although the fire was devastating, many who survived the blaze were taken to the hospital for treatment. With the horrors of the mansion now exposed to the world, an angry mob numbering over 2,000 took to the streets. They gathered at the LaLaurie Mansion, shouting for the sheriff to arrest Delphine for her despicable acts. When that failed to happen, they began destroying what remained of the house, dismantling its walls and breaking its windows. By the next morning, the entire structure was nearly destroyed. Meanwhile, Madame Delphine escaped death and fled to a lake town in Louisiana. Later relocating to Paris, she never was brought to justice for her horrible crimes. Throughout the years, the mansion was bought and resold to multiple owners. In 1894, it stood as apartments, and one of the tenants was brutally murdered. The victim's friend claimed that he had been complaining about demons in the house, going as far to say that the demons wouldn't rest until he met his end. After that, the building was used as a schoolhouse for girls, with many students reporting paranormal events. Numerous girls were reported to have deep scratches on their arms and faces. When their teachers asked who did it, they all replied with similar eerie answers. A ghostly woman had attacked them. Today, thousands of tourists visit the rebuilt LaLaurie Mansion, many reporting hauntings and strange occurrences within its walls. Visitors report hearing moaning sounds from the room where the slaves were kept. Strange footsteps and echoes are also common. Those who have stood near the mansion even claim they were overtaken by a negative energy and quickly left. There's no doubt that something sinister still dwells within the mansion walls, whether it be the ghost of the tortured slaves or the dark spirit of Delphine herself. There's no denying that the evil committed in this house is now here to stay. Number 2. The Villisca Axe Murder House. Our next stop takes us to the little town of Villisca, Iowa. This quaint little 2-story house was the location of a gruesome family murder. On June 9, 1912, Josiah Moore, his wife Sarah, and their 4 children returned home from a church children's party. The Moores were devoted members of the Presbyterian church in town, and they actively participated in church activities, including children's parties. That night, 2 of the neighbors' children, Ina and Lena Stillinger, decided to have a sleepover with the Moore children: Herman, Mary, Arthur, and Paul. The Moores and the Stillingers returned home from the party around 9:30 p.m. and got ready for bed. Josiah, who would normally walk the entire house before bedtime as a safety precaution, had forgotten this night. The neighborhood was a small one, and everyone trusted each other, so it wasn't uncommon for the Moores and other families to simply leave their doors unlocked. Little did they know that a killer had let himself in and was lurking inside their attic. Earlier that night, the killer had found Josiah's splitting axe outside in the backyard and decided to use it to commit his heinous acts. The Moores and Stillingers laid in their bed as the killer patiently waited and even smoked 2 cigarettes in the attic. Once they had finally fallen asleep, he crawled out of his hiding place with the axe in hand. First, the shadowy figure tiptoed into Josiah's room, where he and Sarah slept soundly. The killer moved to the edge of their bed before hacking Josiah over 30 times. Reports state that Josiah was hit so many times that his eyes were completely obliterated. Before Sarah could even wake up and make sense of what was going on, the killer began hacking her as well. After finishing off the parents, he made his way to the children's bedrooms, where Herman, Catherine, Boyd, and Paul slept. He approached each of their beds, turning the axe around to use the blunt side, and began ending their lives one by one. After killing the entire Moore family, he still wasn't satisfied. He then made his way downstairs, where Ina and Lena Stillinger were still asleep. Although it's believed that Lena awoke at some point, as she had defensive wounds on her arms and hands. He again used the blunt side of the axe to brutally end their lives. When the killer had finished, he placed a cloth over their faces and did something bizarre. He ransacked the dressers for clothing and used them to cover all the windows and mirrors in the house. He then also neatly placed a 4-pound slab of bacon next to the bloody axe. He appeared to make himself a plate of food and bloody water before sneaking off into the night. Sadly, the truth of what happened to this family is still a mystery, and no killer has ever been found. After the news of the family's death went viral, hundreds arrived at the crime scene to view their mutilated bodies. The massive disturbance at the site prevented detectives from collecting sufficient evidence and severely contaminated the crime scene. But who wanted the Moores dead? This church-going family seemed to be loved by everyone and had no enemies. During the investigation, a few suspects were identified, and one even brought to trial. Enter Reverend George Jacqueline Kelly. Reverend Kelly was a traveling minister and was present that night at the church children's party. He was known to have a mental illness and was even accused of peeping and being inappropriate with young girls. It was also widely known that he had suffered a mental breakdown at some point in his life, making him unstable. When the police interviewed him, he confessed to killing all 8 victims with a bizarre reason. The Reverend had said that while walking on the street that night, a shadow told him to "suffer the children come unto me." When he followed this spiritual shadow through the night, it led him to the Moore's house. He then heard a voice deep inside him ordering him to kill the entire family. Detectives noted he was left-handed, which matched the evidence at the crime scene. And it was also reported that he had been staring at the Moores in church that night. The police later learned that Reverend Kelly had schizophrenia and debated on whether he had just made the entire story up. After 2 separate trials, Kelly was acquitted due to his mental illness. Prosecutors would go on to name 2 other suspects. The first was a serial killer, William Blackie Mansfield, who had committed similar axe murders in surrounding states. However, he was later found to have an alibi the night of the murders. Second was Frank Jones, a local businessman and Josiah's competitor. Mr. Moore worked for Frank before starting his own farm equipment business, and there were rumors that Josiah was having an affair with Frank's daughter-in-law. Though there never really was evidence to support this, the case eventually went cold and is still unsolved to this day. The house went through many owners over the years after the axe murders, including Martha Lynn, who purchased the Villisca Murder House in 1994 and restored it to its original 1912 condition. She stripped the structure of all plumbing and electricity, and today it stands as a tourist attraction with hundreds of visitors daily. Visitors can stay the night in this creepy house and experience for themselves footsteps in the attic and shadowy figures in the candlelight. Due to the paranormal activities recorded here, it's now considered one of the most regularly visited sites for ghost hunters. In 2014, Robert Lorson, a self-proclaimed ghost hunter, visited the Villisca Murder House with his friends. At some point in the exploration, they parted ways and Stephen found himself alone in the northwest bedroom while the rest of his friends were outside. Suddenly, his friends heard him calling for help on the radio. When they made it inside, they found him stabbed in the chest and bleeding. Medics determined it was a self-inflicted injury and he was taken to a nearby hospital for treatment. However, this is where things get creepier. The incident occurred around 12:45 a.m., around the same time the 1912 murders would have occurred. Whether you believe spirits made him do it or not, there's no denying that this house has a truly gruesome history. Well, that's going to do it for our episode today. We hope you enjoyed exploring the top 2 houses with disturbing backstories. Let's hear your thoughts in the comments below, and be sure to subscribe for more top 2 videos each week. My name is Josh, and thank you for watching Bizarre Legends.